Our mother died this morning. We have nowhere to go. The words came out between sobs from the lips of two children, enchanted by the rain, standing at the door of the most mansion in town. Millionaire Richard Stone, known for his ruthless business acumen, looked at the orphan twins and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. He had no idea that this decision would change his life forever, but no one imagined what would come next. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The screech of brakes cut through the October night like a death cry. Richard Stone's hands gripped the steering wheel of his Bentley, knuckles white as bone, as he stared at what no man should ever have to see. Two small boys, no older than 7, collapsed against each other on the sidewalk outside St. Mary's Hospital, their thin bodies shaking with sobs that would haunt him forever. "Please, God, please bring Mama back," one whispered into the rain, his voice breaking on every word. "We'll be good, we promise. We'll be so good. We won't ask for ice cream anymore, or stay up late watching cartoons." Richard had built a fortune of $900 million by being ruthless. Stone Industries didn't get to the top by showing mercy. At 62, he'd crushed competitors, destroyed careers, and walked away from every emotional entanglement without looking back. His penthouse was a monument to success, empty, cold, and perfectly controlled. His heart had been locked in ice for 25 years, ever since the day his own daughter walked out of his life forever, screaming words that still echoed in his nightmares. But tonight, something shattered inside his chest. The twins were identical, same sandy brown hair plastered to their skulls, same green eyes swimming with tears, same desperate way they clung to each other like drowning sailors. The smaller one, trembling in a jacket 3 sizes too big with holes in the elbows, kept trying to shelter his brother from the downpour. "Liam, what if nobody comes for us?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper, lost in the thunder. "What if they put us in different homes? What if I never see you again?" "Someone will come," Liam said, though his own voice cracked with doubt. He was trying so hard to be brave, this tiny boy with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Mama said angels watch over little boys who have nowhere to go. She said family always finds a way back to each other. Family. The word hit Richard like a physical blow. Angels. Richard almost laughed at the bitter irony. If there were angels, they'd abandoned him long ago when pride became more important than love, when business became more precious than blood. But as he watched these children, these broken, beautiful children who had nothing but each other, something stirred in the frozen wasteland of his soul. 25 years ago, he'd let pride destroy the most precious thing in his life. He'd sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. But looking at Liam and Jake, seeing the way they protected each other even in their darkest hour, Richard Stone made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out into the storm. "Boys," his voice was softer than it had been in decades, competing with the rain. "I'm Richard, and you're not going to spend another night in the rain." What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that these weren't just any orphan children. In his hands were the threads of a family tapestry, torn apart by pride and pain, waiting to be woven back together. The boys, who would soon call him guardian, carried a secret in their very DNA that would turn his world upside down. Some angels, it seems, come disguised as the very people we think we've lost forever. The stone mansion loomed against the night sky like a fortress of solitude, its Gothic towers piercing the darkness like accusations against heaven itself. Richard's hands trembled as he pushed open the 12-foot mahogany doors, revealing an interior that screamed of wealth but whispered of bone-deep loneliness. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had never heard children's laughter, while oil paintings of long-dead ancestors stared down with eyes that held no warmth. "Holy cow!" Jake breathed, his small voice echoing in the cavernous foyer like a prayer in an empty cathedral. "Do you live in a castle, Mr. Richard? Are you a king or something? This place is bigger than our whole neighborhood." "It's just a house," Richard replied, but watching their wide-eyed wonder made him see his prison through different eyes. When had these walls become so cold? When had success started feeling like solitary confinement? The mansion had 43 rooms, but until tonight it had felt smaller than a coffin. Liam grabbed his brother's hand, both boys staying close together like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to driftwood. "Are you sure it's okay for us to be here? We don't want to break anything expensive. Mama always said rich people's things cost more than we could ever pay back." The innocence in those words hit Richard like a sledgehammer to the chest. These children, who had nothing but wet clothes on their backs, were worried about damaging his possessions. When had he become the kind of man that children feared disappointing? "You won't break anything that matters," he said softly, meaning it more than any contract he'd ever signed. Mrs. Henderson, his longtime housekeeper, appeared from the kitchen carrying fresh towels and steaming mugs of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows. She'd worked for the Stone family for 40 years, had practically raised Richard's own daughter in these very halls, and Richard saw something flicker in her weathered eyes as she looked at the twins. Not disapproval, something else, something that looked dangerously like recognition. "Mr. Stone," she whispered, as the boys explored the sitting room with reverent touches. "Those eyes, the way they tilt their heads when they're curious, they remind me of someone we both love very much." "Just get them settled in the guest wing," Richard cut her off sharply. He wasn't ready for memories tonight. Not when his heart was already cracking open in ways he'd forgotten were possible. As Jake curled up in an armchair that could swallow 3 of him, Liam approached Richard with something clutched in his small fist, like a sacred treasure. "Mr. Richard, thank you for saving us. Mama always said there were good people in the world, even when everything seemed dark. She said angels come when you need them most, but sometimes they wear expensive suits." He pressed something into Richard's palm, a small tarnished locket that felt warm from the boy's grip. "This was Mama's most precious thing. She said it would protect us. Maybe it brought us to you." Richard stared at the locket, his heart stopping mid-beat. The intricate rose pattern, the tiny dent near the clasp, the familiar weight. He knew this piece of jewelry. He'd given it to someone decades ago, someone who'd walked out forever. But that was impossible, wasn't it? 3 weeks passed, like a dream Richard never wanted to wake from, each sunrise bringing small miracles he'd forgotten existed. The mansion that had been his golden prison, transformed into something he'd lost so long ago, he'd forgotten its name, a home filled with purpose and joy. The boys' laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for decades, their footsteps bringing life to rooms that had become museums of his hollow achievements. "Mr. Richard! Mr. Richard!" Jake burst into his study one crisp November morning, dragging a reluctant Liam behind him, both boys still in their dinosaur pajamas, with hair sticking up like tiny roosters. "We made you something super special." Richard looked up from quarterly reports that suddenly seemed as meaningful as yesterday's newspaper compared to the excitement blazing in those green eyes. His coffee sat forgotten, growing cold as he watched these children who'd turned his world upside down in the most beautiful way possible. "What is it?" he asked, pushing aside documents worth millions of dollars. Liam shyly presented a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands with a taller figure standing nearby under a wonky yellow sun with a smiling face. "It's us," he explained, his cheeks pink with embarrassment. "And that's you. Jake wanted to draw you with a big smile, but I said I've never seen you smile, so we drew you regular. But we gave you a red tie because you always wear nice ties." The innocent honesty hit Richard like a physical blow to the solar plexus. When had he stopped smiling? When had joy become such a foreign concept that children noticed its absence? He'd built an empire, but lost his ability to find happiness in simple moments. "Well," Richard said, fighting the unfamiliar tightness in his throat, "maybe it's time I gave you something new to draw." And for the first time in 25 years, Richard Stone smiled. Really smiled. Not the calculated expression he wore in boardrooms, not the polite mask for charity galas, but a genuine smile that started in his heart and spread across his face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Jake whooped with delight, jumping up and down like a tiny tornado of pure joy. "See, Liam, I told you he could smile. Now we can draw him happy. Can we draw you laughing next time?" But it was Liam's quiet observation that shattered the last of Richard's carefully constructed walls. "You look just like Mama when you smile." She had the same sad eyes that got happy when she looked at us. Sometimes she'd stare at old pictures and get that exact same look, like she was remembering something beautiful and painful at the same time. That night, Richard found himself standing in the boys' doorway, watching them sleep in moonlight streaming through tall windows. They'd pushed their twin beds together despite having a room larger than most apartments, still needing the security of each other's presence. In the silver light, with peaceful faces and tousled hair, they looked like angels sent to heal a broken old man's heart. His angels. But Liam's words echoed in his mind like church bells that wouldn't stop ringing. "You look just like Mama." The world was full of people with similar features, similar expressions. Coincidences happened every day. So why did his hands shake as he reached for his phone to call his private investigator, Mr. Stone, about those adoption papers? Attorney Margaret Wells shuffled through documents across his mahogany conference table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early morning hour. "We'll need complete background information on the boys, birth certificates, medical records, information about their mother, their father, if he's known." The courts are extremely thorough these days, especially with high-profile adoptions involving substantial wealth transfers. Richard nodded, though his stomach churned like a washing machine stuck on spin cycle. The private investigator he'd hired, James Morton, had been digging into Sarah Mitchell's past for 2 weeks with frustratingly sparse results. The man was Philadelphia's best, had uncovered corporate espionage and tracked down missing heirs across continents. But somehow 2 orphaned boys and their dead mother had become his greatest challenge. "What have you found so far?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. Morton opened his file with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd spent 30 years uncovering secrets people desperately wanted to keep buried. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, 28 years old, died of congenital heart failure at St. Mary's Hospital on October 15th. Single mother, worked 3 jobs to support the twins, overnight cleaning at an office building, morning shift at Murphy's Diner, weekend catering for wedding parties. But here's where it gets interesting, Mr. Stone. There's virtually no record of her existence before exactly 5 years and 2 months ago. What do you mean? Richard felt his blood pressure spike dangerously. "I mean, she appeared in Philadelphia like a ghost, materializing from thin air. New Social Security application, first apartment lease, first job application, first utility connections, first bank account. Everything starting on the same date 5 years ago. Before that moment, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell didn't exist in any database, any system, any record I can access. It's like she was born fully grown at age 23. Richard's blood ran cold as Arctic wind. "People don't just appear from nowhere, Morton. That's impossible." "No, sir, they don't. But people running from dangerous situations, people hiding from abusive relationships, people who need to disappear completely. They sometimes create entirely new identities, professional name changes, forged documents, complete life reinvention. The question is, what was Sarah Mitchell running from? And more importantly, Who was she before she became Sarah Mitchell? That evening, Richard found the boys in the mansion's sprawling garden, building an elaborate fort out of fallen autumn leaves, their cheeks red from crisp air and eyes bright with the simple joy of childhood. Their laughter drifted through the evening like music he'd forgotten how to hear, a symphony of innocence that made his chest ache with unexpected tenderness and long-buried memories. Liam looked up as Richard approached, his small face serious beyond his 7 years. "Mr. Richard, are you going to keep us forever and ever? Jake has terrible nightmares that you'll change your mind and send us back to that scary place with all the other kids nobody wants." "I'm never changing my mind," Richard said, surprised by the fierce protectiveness that roared to life in his voice. "You're my boys now. Nothing will ever change that." "Really?" Jake's face lit up like Christmas morning and 4th of July combined. "Even though we don't have your last name? Even though we're not really your family? Even though we're just random kids you found crying in the rain?" Family. That word again, hitting him like a punch to the heart. Richard knelt in the damp leaves, his expensive suit forgotten. Family isn't always about blood, boys. Sometimes it's about choice. And I choose you, forever. But Morton's findings haunted him like whispers in an empty house. The nightmare always started the same way, like a movie reel he couldn't stop or rewind. Richard was 37 years old again, standing in his study, while his daughter Emily screamed at him through tears of rage and heartbreak, her face flushed with the passion of youth and the agony of betrayal that cut deeper than any business loss he'd ever suffered. "You'll never accept him, will you? Because he doesn't wear $1,000 suits or speak with the right accent or come from the right bloodline. Because he works with his hands instead of manipulating people in boardrooms. He's a construction worker, Emily. You're throwing away your Harvard MBA, your trust fund, your entire golden future for what? A man who builds other people's dreams instead of his own. I'm choosing love over money, something you never understood because your heart is made of the same cold marble as this mausoleum you call home." The memory of her final words still sliced through him like shattered glass. "I hope someday you realize what you've lost, Father. But by then, it'll be too late to get it back. Goodbye forever." Richard woke with a gasp, sweat beading his forehead despite November chill seeping through bedroom windows. 25 years, and the wound still bled like it had been carved yesterday with a rusty knife. Emily had walked out that night in her white wedding dress. Yes, she'd been planning to elope and never return to this house or his life. His private investigators had tracked her to Chicago, then Los Angeles, then Denver, then Phoenix, then nothing. She'd vanished like smoke dispersed by wind, like she'd never existed at all. Just like Sarah Mitchell had appeared from nowhere 5 years ago. The thought struck him like lightning, splitting an oak tree down the middle. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. But that was impossible. Emily would be 53 now. Sarah Mitchell had been only 28 when she died. The mathematics didn't work, couldn't work. Unless Emily had changed her name completely. Unless she'd created a new identity. Unless she'd been running from him. "Mr. Richard?" Liam's small voice from the doorway made him jump like a guilty man caught stealing. "You were making scary noises and talking in your sleep. Are you okay? Do you have bad dreams about monsters too?" Richard looked at the boy silhouetted in moonlight. The gentle curve of his face, the way he held his thin shoulders, the concern in those green eyes that looked so achingly familiar, it made his chest tight with unnamed emotion. "Just old memories," Richard managed, his voice rough with sleep and 25 years of accumulated sorrow. "What about you, son? Can't sleep?" Liam padded closer on bare feet, climbing into the oversized leather armchair by Richard's bed like he belonged there, like he'd always belonged there. Jake snoring like a freight train again. But also, I was thinking about Mama. She used to have terrible dreams, too. She'd cry in her sleep and say, "Daddy, I'm sorry," over and over, like she was apologizing to someone who couldn't hear her anymore. Richard's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Did she ever talk about her father, about her family before you boys were born? Sometimes, late at night, when she thought we were asleep, she said he was a very important man who lived in a mansion like this one, but he didn't want her anymore because she chose love over his approval. She said she hoped someday he'd remember that she loved him desperately, even though they were separated by oceans of hurt. She said love doesn't die just because people say cruel goodbyes. The room spun around Richard like a carnival ride, gone mad. Important man. Mansion. Those eyes, Emily's eyes, staring back at him from this innocent child's face. "Liam," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "what was your mama's real name? Her name before she had you boys." "Maidish," she said her birth name was too painful to use because it reminded her of everything beautiful she'd lost. But she told us her daddy gave her a special nickname when she was little, Emmy. She said it meant beloved. But she stopped feeling beloved when she chose happiness over money. Emily. Richard's carefully constructed world exploded into a million glittering pieces. Richard's hands shook like autumn leaves in a hurricane as he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the locket Liam had pressed into his palm weeks ago. The tarnished silver felt heavy as lead, weighted with possibilities too terrible and too wonderful to contemplate. He'd been too terrified to open it, too afraid of what truth might be waiting inside that tiny silver prison. But now he had to know. Now he had to face what his heart had been screaming since that first night in the rain. The tiny clasp opened with a soft click that sounded like thunder in his quiet study, revealing two photographs that made his knees buckle and his world tilt off its axis. On the left, a picture of the twins as babies, faces round and innocent, sleeping in each other's arms like matching angels. On the right, a photograph that simultaneously destroyed and rebuilt his entire universe, a young woman with flowing chestnut hair and green eyes that held both infinite love and infinite sadness. Emily, his daughter. Older, worn thin by life's hardships and the exhausting weight of raising two children alone on minimum wage, but unmistakably his child. The baby he'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the little girl who'd followed him around his office, asking endless questions, the teenager who'd challenged him at dinner table debates, the young woman who'd walked out of his life in a white dress and broken his heart into pieces he'd never reassembled. The woman he'd mourned for 25 years was Sarah Mitchell. The boys he'd fallen desperately in love with, the children who'd brought laughter back to his tomb of a mansion and joy back to his frozen heart, were his own grandchildren, Emily's sons, the family he'd lost through stubborn pride and unforgiving anger. "Oh, God," he whispered, pressing the locket against his chest, as tears he'd held back for decades finally broke free like a dam bursting. "Emily, forgive me. What have I done to us? What have we both done?" She'd been living just 3 hours away in Philadelphia, struggling to raise his grandchildren in poverty while he'd lived in his ivory tower of bitterness and regret. She'd worked herself to death at 3 jobs, her heart giving out from exhaustion and stress, all because he'd been too proud to forgive, too stubborn to reach out first, too convinced that admitting love was admitting weakness. And she'd named them after the family she'd lost. Liam after his middle name William, and Jake after his own father, Jacob Stone. Even in exile, even after everything cruel that had passed between them, she'd kept pieces of the Stone family legacy alive in her children. She'd loved him, even when he'd failed catastrophically to love her back. The irony was devastating and beautiful and tragic all at once. He'd found his grandsons by pure chance, saved them from the rain on the exact night his daughter died, never knowing he was gathering the scattered, broken pieces of his own family. Emily had found a way to bring her children home, even in death, orchestrated by forces beyond understanding. "Mr. Richard," Jake's worried voice from the doorway made him look up through tears that fell like healing rain on his cheeks. "Why are you crying? Did we do something wrong? Are you sad because we're here bothering you?" Richard looked at the boy, his grandson, standing there in dinosaur pajamas, with concern written across his face like worry was too heavy for such small shoulders. Behind him, Liam appeared, and together they looked exactly like Emily at their age, so much so that Richard's heart nearly stopped beating. "No," he managed, his voice thick with 25 years of grief and joy and regret and desperate hope. "You didn't do anything wrong. You did everything right. You both did everything perfectly, beautifully, miraculously right. Because somehow, his daughter had brought her children home. Even in death, Emily had given him the most precious gift imaginable, a second chance at family, at love, at redemption he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Now, he just had to find the courage to tell two 7-year-old boys that their guardian was actually their grandfather, and their beloved mama had been his daughter all along. Richard sat in his study until dawn broke over the Philadelphia skyline, the locket clutched in his trembling hands like a lifeline to the past. Every few minutes he'd open it again, staring at Emily's face as if looking long enough could somehow bring her back, could give him the chance to say the words he should have spoken 25 years ago. The boys were still sleeping, his grandsons, Emily's children, and with each passing hour the weight of what he had to tell them grew heavier. How do you explain to 7-year-old children that their entire world has shifted, that the kind stranger who saved them from the rain is actually their family, their blood, their grandfather who failed their mother so completely she'd rather die in poverty than come home? Mrs. Henderson knocked softly and entered with coffee and the morning paper. "You've been up all night, haven't you?" she said, her voice gentle with the wisdom of 4 decades serving the Stone family. "It's about those boys, isn't it? About who they really are." Richard looked up with eyes red from tears and sleeplessness. "You knew, didn't you? From the first night?" She nodded slowly, settling into the chair across from his desk. Those eyes, that stubborn tilt of the chin when they're determined about something, the way Liam protects his brother just like she used to protect the neighborhood strays. "They're Emily's children, Mr. Stone, your grandchildren." She was living 3 hours away, Margaret. 3 hours. She was dying, working herself to death, and I never knew. His voice broke on the words. "My daughter raised my grandsons in poverty while I sat in this mansion, counting money like some modern-day Scrooge. Emily was proud, just like her father," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "She wouldn't have come back even if she'd been starving. But she sent her children to you, didn't she? In the end, when it mattered most, she made sure they'd find their way home." Richard stared out the window where autumn sunlight painted the garden gold. "How do I tell them? How do I explain that I'm not just their guardian, I'm their family? That their mother was my daughter, and I drove her away because I couldn't accept that love mattered more than status?" "You tell them the truth," she said simply. "Children are stronger than we think, and those boys have survived losing their mother. They can survive learning they've gained a grandfather." But as Richard climbed the stairs toward their room, each step felt like walking toward Judgment Day. In his pocket, the locket seemed to pulse with the weight of 25 years of mistakes. At their door, he paused, listening to their quiet morning voices, discussing whether they should make him breakfast in bed as a surprise. His grandsons. Emily's legacy, the second chance he'd never dared hope for. Taking a deep breath, Richard Stone knocked on the door and prepared to change their lives forever. Again. The truth, he realized, was both the heaviest burden and the most precious gift he'd ever carried. Today he would find out which one it would be, for the boys who had already given him back his heart. Behind the door, he heard Jake's excited whisper, "Maybe Mr. Richard wants to have pancakes with us." If only it were that simple. If only the most important conversation of his life could happen over pancakes and orange juice, with syrup-sticky fingers and the kind of innocent joy that had been missing from his world for far too long. But some truths, Richard knew, required more than breakfast could provide. Some revelations demanded courage he wasn't sure he possessed, forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved, and love he wasn't sure he knew how to give properly this time. Still, for Emily's sake, for the daughter he'd lost and found again in the faces of her children, he had to try. "Boys," Richard said, settling into the chair by their window as morning light streamed across their unmade beds, "we need to have a very important talk." Jake bounced excitedly on his mattress, still in his dinosaur pajamas. "Are we in trouble? Did we break something expensive? Liam said we shouldn't have played soccer in the hallway yesterday." "You're not in trouble," Richard assured them, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But what I'm going to tell you might be confusing at first. It's about your mama, and about me, and about how sometimes families get lost, and then find each other in the most unexpected ways." Liam's green eyes, Emily's eyes, grew serious as he sensed the gravity in Richard's voice. "Is it something sad? Because we've had enough sad things happen." Richard pulled out the locket, opening it to reveal the photographs inside. "This belonged to your mama, didn't it?" Both boys nodded and Jake leaned forward eagerly. "That's her!" "That's our mama when she was prettier, before she got too tired all the time." "Boys," Richard's voice was gentle but firm, "your mama's name wasn't always Sarah Mitchell. A long time ago, before you were born, she had a different name. Her real name was Emily Stone." The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither side was sure they could cross. "Stone?" Liam whispered. "Like your name?" "Yes, like my name. Because—" Richard took the deepest breath of his life. "Because Emily Stone was my daughter. Your mama was my little girl, which means you're not just two boys I found in the rain. You're my grandsons. You're my family." The words hung in the air like soap bubbles, beautiful and fragile, and ready to burst at the slightest touch. Both boys stared at him with identical expressions of shock, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with disbelief. Jake was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "You're our grandpa." "Nah, I am," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your grandfather, and I've been looking for you my whole life without even knowing it." Liam's face crumpled as understanding dawned. "But why didn't Mama tell us? Why didn't she bring us to meet you? Why did we have to find you by accident?" This was the question Richard had dreaded, the one that required him to admit his greatest failure. "Because your Mama and I had a terrible fight many years ago before you were born. I said awful things, did awful things, and I was too proud and too stubborn to apologize. She was too hurt to come home, and I was too scared to go looking for her." "What kind of fight?" Jake asked, his lower lip trembling. "The worst kind," Richard said honestly. "The kind where two people who love each other say things they can never take back. I thought I knew what was best for her life, and she thought I didn't understand what made her happy. We were both right, and we were both wrong, and by the time I realized that, she was gone." Liam slid off his bed and walked slowly toward Richard, his small face grave with 7-year-old wisdom. "Mama cried sometimes when she looked at pictures. Were they pictures of you?" "Probably," Richard admitted, his heart breaking all over again. "Just like I cried sometimes when I thought about her." "So you missed her too?" Jake asked, hope creeping into his voice. "Every single day for 25 years, Richard said. "And now I have you, and it's like having pieces of her back. You have her eyes, her smile, her kind heart. You're the best parts of your mama, living and breathing and giving me a second chance to be the family I should have been all along." The boys looked at each other in that wordless way twins communicate, having an entire conversation in glances and raised eyebrows. Finally, Liam took another step closer. "If you're really our grandpa," he said seriously, "does that mean we can stay here forever? Does that mean we're really, truly home?" "Yes," Richard said, opening his arms as both boys rushed toward him. "It means you're home, and you're loved, and you never have to be afraid of being alone again." As he held his grandsons, Emily's children, Richard felt something inside his chest heal that had been broken for a quarter century. The little boys in his arms smelled like sleepy warmth and innocence, and when they hugged him back with all their might, he finally understood what his daughter had died protecting: love. Pure, unconditional, irreplaceable love. "Tell us about Mama when she was little," Jake demanded, curled up against Richard's left side in the mansion's enormous library, surrounded by leather-bound books that stretched to the cathedral ceiling. "Was she as pretty as she was when we knew her?" Richard smiled, stroking Liam's hair as the boy leaned against his right shoulder. 3 days had passed since the revelation, and the twins had adapted to learning they had a grandfather with the remarkable resilience that only children possess. She was the most beautiful little girl in the world, with curly brown hair that never stayed in place and eyes that sparkled with mischief. "Just like Jake's hair," Liam giggled, reaching over to ruffle his brother's unruly locks. "Exactly like that," Richard agreed, his heart warm with the memory. "She used to sneak into my office during important business meetings and hide under my desk. I'd be negotiating million-dollar deals while she made faces at my shoes." "Did you get mad?" Jake asked, his eyes wide with the delicious possibility of their perfect mother having been a troublemaker. "Sometimes," Richard admitted. "But mostly I thought it was funny, even when I had to pretend to be serious. She had this way of making everything brighter, just like you boys do." Liam shifted closer, his voice dropping to the reverent whisper children use for important questions. "Why did you fight with her, Grandpa? What made her so sad that she had to go away?" Richard had known this question was coming, had spent sleepless nights preparing for it. "Your mama fell in love with a man I didn't approve of. He was a good man, a kind man who made her happy, but I thought she deserved someone richer, someone who could give her everything I thought was important." "Like fancy clothes and big houses?" Jake asked. "Exactly like that. I was so worried about money and status that I forgot the only thing that really mattered, that she was happy and loved. When she told me she was going to marry him, I said terrible things. I told her if she married him, she wasn't my daughter anymore." Both boys gasped, their faces reflecting the horror of such a pronouncement. "That's the meanest thing ever," Liam whispered. "No wonder she cried when she talked about you." "It was the meanest thing ever," Richard agreed, his throat tight with old grief. "And the stupidest thing I ever did in my entire life. Because the moment she walked out that door, I knew I'd made the worst mistake a father could make." "But she still loved you," Jake said with the certainty of a child who understood love in its purest form. "She named us after your family, didn't she? Liam for your middle name and me for your daddy?" Richard nodded, amazed by their insight. "She did. Even when she was hurt and angry, she kept pieces of our family alive in you boys. That's how much your mama loved all of us." "What happened to our daddy?" Liam asked quietly. "The man she loved?" Richard's chest tightened. This was harder territory, one where his investigators had found painful truths. "His name was Michael Rivers, and he died in a construction accident 2 years before you were born. Your mama was pregnant with you when it happened." The boys absorbed this information with the solemn gravity of children who'd already learned that life could be unfair and adults couldn't protect them from every heartbreak. "So, she was all alone when we came?" Jake asked. "She was, but she was also the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known. She worked 3 jobs to take care of you, read you stories every night, made sure you knew you were loved, even when she was exhausted. And now we have you, Liam said simply. Mama sent us to you, didn't she? Even though she couldn't come herself. Richard hugged them closer, his voice thick with emotion. I think she did. I think somehow, some way, your mama made sure you'd find your way home to family, because that's what mothers do. They protect their children even when they can't be there themselves. Will you tell us more stories tomorrow? Jake asked, his eyelids heavy with approaching sleep. Every day, Richard promised. I have 25 years of stories about your mama, and now we'll make new ones together. Stories about the boys who taught their grandfather how to smile again, how to laugh again, how to love again. Udil, as the boys drifted off to sleep in his arms, Richard realized Emily had given him more than grandsons. She'd given him redemption, wrapped in dinosaur pajamas and gap-toothed grins. There's something I want to show you, Richard said the next morning, leading the boys up the mansion's grand staircase to the 3rd floor, where he hadn't set foot in 25 years. His hands trembled slightly as he approached a door at the end of the hall, one that had remained locked since the day Emily walked out of his life. What's behind there? Liam asked, sensing the importance of the moment in the way children intuitively recognize when adults are about to share something sacred. Your mama's room, Richard said softly, producing an old brass key from his pocket. I locked it the day she left and never opened it again. I couldn't bear to face what I'd lost. The key turned with a soft click that seemed to echo through decades of silence. The door opened slowly, revealing a time capsule frozen in 1999. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto a room that belonged to a young woman on the verge of independence. College pennants on the walls, bookshelves stuffed with novels and philosophy texts, a desk still scattered with notes from her MBA program. Both boys stepped inside with the reverence of pilgrims entering a shrine. It still smells like her, Jake whispered, running his small fingers along the edge of a vanity table topped with perfume bottles and jewelry boxes, like flowers and vanilla and something that made us feel safe. Richard's chest tightened as he watched them explore. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph he'd forgotten existed. Emily at age 7, the same age as the twins, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while hugging a golden retriever named Shakespeare. She looks just like us, Liam exclaimed, picking up the photo with wonder. That was taken in this very house, Richard said, his voice thick with memory. She insisted on naming that dog after her favorite writer, even though your grandmother thought it was pretentious for a 10-year-old. Jake had discovered Emily's bookshelf and was pulling out volume after volume. She liked the same stories we do. Look, Liam, Where the Wild Things Are, The Giving Tree, Charlotte's Web. Mama used to read these to us. But it was Liam who made the discovery that stopped Richard's heart. From beneath Emily's bed, he pulled out a dusty photo album bound in pink leather. What's this, Grandpa? Richard knelt beside him as Liam opened the album to the first page. There, in Emily's careful handwriting, were the words, "For my future children, stories about your grandpa." Page after page revealed photographs Richard had never seen. Emily as a baby in his arms, as a toddler riding on his shoulders, building sandcastles during family vacations, dressed up for father-daughter dances, graduating from high school with Richard beaming proudly beside her. She made this for us? Jake breathed, settling on the floor to study every image. She did, Richard said, his voice breaking as he read her handwritten captions. Daddy teaching me to ride a bike. Daddy and me at the zoo. Daddy helping with homework. My hero, my daddy. And on the final page, Emily had written a letter. To my future children, your grandfather is the strongest, smartest, most loving man I've ever known. If something happens to me, if we're ever apart, remember that you come from a family that knows how to love deeply. Find your way back to each other, to each Love is worth fighting for, worth forgiving for, worth everything. Mama. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Richard's quiet tears falling onto pages his daughter had prepared for grandsons she'd never gotten to introduce him to properly. "She knew," Liam said with 7-year-old wisdom. "She knew we'd find you someday." "She never stopped believing we'd be a family again," Richard realized aloud. "Even when I'd given up hope, she was planning for this moment." Jake crawled into Richard's lap, the photo album balanced between them. "Can we keep this in our room, so we can look at pictures of Mama and you whenever we miss her?" "Of course," Richard said, holding both boys close in Emily's childhood sanctuary. "This whole room is yours now. Your Mama's books, her pictures, her memories, they all belong to you." As they sat together, surrounded by Emily's presence, Richard finally understood what his daughter had been trying to tell him 25 years ago. Love wasn't about money or status or approval. Love was about showing up, about choosing family over pride, about second chances and forgiveness and the courage to admit when you're wrong. Emily had spent the last 25 years teaching him that lesson, and now, through her children, the lesson was finally complete. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow blanketing the stone mansion, transforming the Gothic architecture into something from a fairy tale. Richard woke to the sound of squealing laughter and small feet thundering down the grand staircase, followed by Jake's voice shouting, "Grandpa! Santa found us! He found us at your house!" In the past 2 months, since learning the truth about their connection, the mansion had undergone a transformation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, toys were scattered across Persian rugs, and the sound of laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for decades. Richard made his way downstairs to find both boys surrounded by wrapping paper and boxes, their faces glowing with Christmas morning magic. But it wasn't the expensive gifts that made his heart swell. It was seeing Liam carefully helping Jake open a particularly stubborn package, the same protective instinct Emily had shown as a child. "Look what Santa brought!" Jake held up a framed photograph, a professional portrait Richard had commissioned of the 3 of them, taken just last week. In it, they were laughing at something off-camera, and for the first time in 25 years, Richard's smile reached his eyes. "That's not from Santa," Liam said, with the knowing look of a child who'd figured out the truth, but still wanted to believe in magic. "That's from Grandpa. Santa doesn't have access to professional photographers." Richard chuckled, settling onto the floor between them despite his expensive silk pajamas. "How did you get so smart?" "Mama!" both boys said simultaneously, then grinned at each other. The morning passed in a blur of torn wrapping paper, new books, building blocks, and more hugs than Richard had received in the previous decade combined. But the greatest gift came when Mrs. Henderson appeared with hot chocolate and her own surprise. "Boys," she said, settling into her favorite armchair, "I found something in the attic that belonged to your mama when she was your age." She handed them a wooden box that Richard recognized immediately. Emily's treasure chest, where she'd kept her most precious possessions as a child. Inside, Liam and Jake discovered a collection of items that painted a picture of their mother's childhood. Drawings she'd made of the family, a diary with entries about learning to ride a bike, a locket containing a picture of her parents, and dozens of photographs of her and Richard together. "She saved everything," Liam marveled, holding up a crayon drawing titled, "My Daddy is the Best." "Just like you boys save everything important," Richard observed, watching Jake carefully examine each treasure. "Grandpa," Jake said suddenly, looking up with Emily's earnest green eyes, "are we a real family now? Like forever and ever, no matter what?" The question hung in the air, weighted with all the abandonment and loss these children had experienced in their short lives. "We're the realest family that ever existed," Richard said firmly, pulling both boys close. "We're connected by love, by choice, by your mama's spirit that brought us together." Nothing in this world will ever change that. Even if we're bad sometimes, Liam asked. Even if you're terrible sometimes, Richard assured him with a smile. Families love each other through good days and bad days, through arguments and forgiveness, through everything life throws at us. As the boys dove back into their Christmas treasures, Richard caught Mrs. Henderson's eye. She nodded toward the mantelpiece, where he'd placed a new photograph beside the family portraits that had been gathering dust for 25 years. Emily's graduation picture, flanked by images of Liam and Jake. 3 generations of Stones, finally reunited. She would be so proud, Mrs. Henderson whispered. Richard nodded, watching his grandsons play with toys that cost a fraction of what he'd spend on a business lunch, yet brought more joy than all his wealth combined. Emily had given him the most precious gift imaginable, not just her children, but the chance to be the grandfather she'd always known he could be. Outside, snow continued to fall on the mansion that was no longer a monument to success, but a home filled with the laughter of children who taught an old man that love was the only currency that truly mattered. Family, Richard had learned, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, about second chances, about choosing each other every single day. And for the first time in 25 years, Richard Stone was finally, completely home. 1 year later, Richard Stone stood in the cemetery where Emily was buried, holding the hands of 2 8-year-old boys who had transformed his entire world. The autumn afternoon was crisp and golden, painting the world in the same colors as that October night when fate had brought them together in the rain. "Tell Mama about our report cards, Grandpa," Jake urged, tugging on Richard's coat sleeve. "Tell her I got an A in reading." "And tell her about the fort we built in the backyard," Liam added, his voice carrying that mixture of excitement and reverence children use when talking to people they love but can't see. Richard smiled, kneeling to place fresh roses on Emily's grave while the boys arranged the drawings they'd brought. Stick figures of 3 people holding hands under a bright yellow sun, just like that first picture they'd made for him over a year ago. "Your mama knows about everything," Richard said softly, his voice carrying none of the bitter grief that had consumed him for 25 years. "She's been watching you boys grow into the most amazing young men, and she's been watching me learn how to be the grandfather she always knew I could be." The headstone was simple: Emily Sarah Stone Mitchell, beloved daughter and mother, love never dies. But Richard had added something special below it. She brought her children home. "Mr. Richard," a familiar voice called from behind them. Richard turned to see James Morton, his private investigator, approaching with a manila envelope in his hands and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Morton, what brings you here?" "I've been working on something for months, Mr. Stone. Something I think you and the boys need to see." He handed over the envelope with the reverence of a man delivering precious cargo. "I finally tracked down Michael Rivers' family, the boys' father's family. They've been looking for Liam and Jake since Emily died." Richard's heart lurched. Looking for them? Michael had a sister, Sarah Rivers MacDonald, who lives in Oregon. She's been searching for her nephews ever since she learned about Emily's death. She wanted to make sure they were safe, that they knew about their father's side of the family. She's been praying someone good had taken them in. Jake looked up with wide eyes. "We have more family?" Morton nodded, pulling out photographs from the envelope. "Your father was the youngest of 3 children. You have an aunt, 2 uncles, and 4 cousins who've been hoping to meet you. And this," he handed Richard a letter, "this is something your father wrote to Emily when he found out she was pregnant with you boys." With trembling hands, Richard opened the letter dated 8 years ago. "My dearest Emily, I know we lost our families when we chose each other, but we're creating something beautiful together. These babies will be loved by parents who understand that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about showing up, about loving even when it's difficult. If something ever happens to us, I hope our children find their way back to the people who matter most. Love always, Michael. Richard's throat tightened as he read the words aloud. Even Emily's husband had understood what Richard had been too proud to see, that love was about choice, about forgiveness, about second chances. "There's more," Morton said gently. "Sarah Rivers MacDonald wants to meet you, Mr. Stone. She said any man who would take in her nephews and love them as his own grandchildren must be the kind of person Michael would have wanted in the boys' lives." Liam and Jake looked at each other with that wordless twin communication. Then both looked up at Richard with identical expressions of hope mixed with uncertainty. "What do you think, boys?" Richard asked. "Would you like to meet your father's family? Will they love us like you do?" Jake asked with the direct honesty that had characterized him from the beginning. "I think they already do," Richard said, looking at the photographs of smiling faces that shared Jake and Liam's nose, their father's gentle eyes. "And I think your mom and daddy brought us all together for a reason." As they walked back toward the car, Jake suddenly stopped and tugged on Richard's hand. "Grandpa, remember that first night when you found us crying in the rain?" "How could I forget?" "I think Mama was there too," Jake said with 8-year-old certainty. "I think she was standing right behind us, pushing us toward you, because that's what mamas do. They make sure their babies find their way home." Richard's eyes filled with tears he no longer tried to hide. Out of the mouths of babes came wisdom that had taken him a lifetime to understand. That evening, as they sat in Emily's old room, now decorated with the boys' artwork and filled with their laughter, Richard made 2 phone calls. The first was to Sarah Rivers MacDonald in Oregon, beginning a conversation that would bring even more love into their already abundant lives. The second was to his lawyers, not about business this time, but about something infinitely more important, establishing a foundation in Emily's name to help orphaned children find loving families, to ensure that no child would ever spend a night crying in the rain without hope of rescue. As he tucked his grandsons into bed that night, Liam looked up at him with Emily's green eyes and asked, "Grandpa, do you think we saved you, or did you save us?" Richard smiled, kissing both boys on their foreheads. "I think we saved each other, just like families are supposed to do." Later, alone in his study, Richard opened Emily's locket one final time. But now, instead of seeing only loss and regret, he saw the future. 2 beautiful boys who carried the best of both their parents, who had taught him that love was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Outside his window, the first snow of winter began to fall, and Richard Stone, grandfather, guardian, and the luckiest man alive, finally understood what his daughter had been trying to tell him all along. Family isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about choosing love over pride, forgiveness over bitterness, hope over despair. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's about second chances that arrive disguised as 2 little boys crying in the rain, carrying angels' wings hidden beneath their tiny broken hearts.